Welcome back, friends. Now, continuing with our Africa and Zulu video trend we've been doing, today we'll be touching on the Battle of Isandlwana. Now, I mentioned this in our last video, but I want to go more in depth of it. The greatest defeat a modern army ever suffered by a less industrialized power. But as always, please comment, like, and share. And if we are a new viewer, I ask that you please subscribe, and let's get into the video. So, when it comes to military defeats that are considered humiliating, one that comes to mind is the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana Territory in 1876, when Colonel George Armstrong Custer led his 7th Cavalry to a catastrophe that would leave him along with 267 troopers dead. However, 3 years later in South Africa, an even more humiliating defeat would occur. To explain Isandlwana, I must start at the beginning, and that is at the appointment of Sir Henry Bartle Frere as High Commissioner of South Africa. From his office in Pietermaritzburg, Frere was concocting a plan. Now, Frere liked how Canada was federalized, and he wanted to copy it in South Africa, but he faced a few different issues. First, there was a confederation of Dutch settlers known as Boers, who had created 2 separate republics in the northern reaches of the South Africa territory, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which bordered the Cape Colony and Natal Colony. But in the eyes of Frere, at this period, they were not the greatest threat. The greatest threat were 50,000 warriors across the Tungala River, known to the natives as the Buffalo River. Sitting across that river northeast of the British possessions was the Zulu Empire, a nation of warriors who at one point steamrolled themselves from a tribe of a few miles size to an empire about the size of New Jersey. The Zulus were being led by a man named King Chelmsford, who had killed his brother to secure his ascension to the throne. But in late 1878, the Zulus, with the exception of small skirmishes, had lived in almost a comfortable peace. Chelmsford had done almost everything to avoid outright war with the English. Frere, however, with the second Lord of Chelmsford and his over 15,000 troops, were sitting ready. But the issue was Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Colonial Secretary Earl of Carnarvon did not want to set off a conflict. But Frere knew the only way to his dream of federalization of South Africa was to remove the Zulu from power in the region. So like a true politician, he wrote an ultimatum to the King of the Zulus, making demands of the empire that he knew the king would not approve. Most specifically, the disbandment of the Zulu armies and the foundation of a British Commission of Council in the Zululands. In short, removing Zulu autonomy in their own land. On December 11th, British representatives came forth and placed the ultimatum at Chelmsford's feet. The king would not even give an answer. When Frere sent a translator to press the king, Chelmsford simply said, "Do I go to the country of the white man and tell him to change his laws and customs? I will not cross the river that divides our lands. But I ask Lord Chelmsford if he would disarm his warriors in the face of such threats." Upon hearing of this, Frere, partly furious and partly happy, declared war, a state of war, against Her Majesty's government and the Zulu kingdom. On January 11th, 1879, Chelmsford ordered a grand invasion of Zululand. He, with the main column, crossed the Buffalo River at the mission station called Rorke's Drift. Meanwhile, 2 armies crossed in the north and south. The objective, the Royal Corral at Yalundi. Chelmsford is, like many English, very contemptuous of the Zulus, believing them inferior and unable to fight against an industrialized power. His main column of 7,800 men and native levies advanced across the grasslands of Zululand. Chelmsford moved towards Mount Nsalawanda. Under the direction of Colonel Henry Pulaine, the commander of the bulk of Chelmsford's regular troops, the 24th Regiment of Foot. Meanwhile, Ceshaweo had ordered his Impi, the Zulu word for army, into the hills, and they split off to confront all three forces. 25,000 were moving towards Isandlwana. But they also had a plan. They would use diversionary actions in front of Ulundi to split the British forces and then attack the main column, who was significantly depleted by Chelmsford pursuing the diversionary force. Chelmsford, whether by stupidity or just sheer arrogance, fell for the bait and pursued. He would reinforce Pulaine at Isandlwana with cavalry commanded by Colonel Anthony Dunford, also a rocket battery to join the artillery battery at Isandlwana. But now, the camp at Isandlwana only had a little over 1,800 men left on the morning of January 22nd, 1879. Now, initially, a British cavalry scouting party came upon young Zulu boys herding cattle. Upon pursuing them, they discovered the entire Impi in a valley. Upon realizing they were discovered, the commander of the Zulus screamed their war cry, Yesuthu. Then the warriors began to charge the cavalry. As Durnford himself was on a patrol then was under attack from a wave of Zulus himself. He would immediately dispatch one of his riders to inform Lord Chelmsford, begging him to return as reinforcements. Back at the camp, however, they had not prepared for the attack. The Boer soldiers that had joined the expedition had insisted on corralling the wagons. This is when you put your wagons in a circle to be a makeshift barricade. But the British insisted it was unnecessary. Pulaine then ordered the artillery moved forward to begin firing on the Zulus. Now, it's very difficult to piece together exactly what happened next, specifically because of the outcome. But we will do our best with what we know. The general, or Nduna, of the Impi, Nikashwa Koza, used the geography to his advantage. He stationed the king's brother and the loins of the buffalo in reserve, in full sight of the British. The head, however, was hidden behind the terrain, as was the left horn. Durnford had been engaged with the right horn since around 11 o'clock a.m., but quickly the head and the left horn revealed themselves. The British kept up a steady fire between their Martini Henry rifles and the 2-pounder cannons that they were using, and the rocket battery, which was unfortunately overwhelmed. But Pulaine began to realize that his weapons were good at range, but the Zulu were much better in hand-to-hand, even than the British infantrymen. Other problems began to plague the British forces as well. Specifically the overheating of the Martini Henrys. They fired quickly. But in South Africa, with the heat and then firing so many shots, it began to overheat the mechanics of the gun, and misfiring began to ensue. Koza, however, had his men ingest the ceremonial food before battle, which in a way kind of made the bullets useless. It had given the warriors an almost berserker-like resolve. The British began to retreat by firing. This is when you fire, fall back behind the next column, fire, and continue. It's kind of like a backwards leapfrog shooting. Durnford led his cavalry back to the main force as the bull began to converge on the British lines. It's at this point at 2:30 a solar eclipse went over the field, confusing both English and Zulu. But the Zulus also began to make the British also began to make pockets of last stands. Reports of large bodies of dead English soldiers illustrated the desperation the men had towards the end. Durnford at this point was having his last stand, realizing there was no hope for victory. He told his native cavalry to flee. When his body was found, he was surrounded by dead native infantry, Natal infantry, and 24th Regiment infantry. Pulaine at this point had ordered Lieutenants Coghill and Melville to save the Queen's colors, which itself has become a subject of debate, which I will discuss soon. I apologize, I'm fighting something. After seeing them off, there are a few different accounts. One, of course, he died amongst his men fighting. The one I believe the most, however, is one cited by historian Donald Morris in his book, The Washing of Spears, in which he states Pulain went back to his tent in an attempt to write a final report to Lord Chelmsford, and he was then killed by a Zulu warrior. This scene is actually depicted in the 1979 Zulu Dawn film, where it shows Pulain being killed by Prince Dinzulu, which obviously was just for the film. Dinzulu was at Isandlwana, but there's no evidence the two ever met on the field. From what I've understood, Dinzulu was probably with the right horn, which was more towards where the fleeing soldiers were. There's no evidence they met. Pulain's body, however, was not found, unlike Dunford's body. The surviving British then began their desperate retreat to what became known as Fugitives Drift, across the river where the Zulus were ordered not to cross. Now, earlier I mentioned Lieutenants Coghill and Melville of the 24th Regiment. Now, the history around the battle tells us that they were given the flag and were trying to get to Rorke's Drift to warn them and save the flag from falling in the hands of the enemy. Both men would actually receive the Victorious Cross for their bravery in attempting to save the flag. But both men would be killed on their way to Rorke's Drift. The two would be discovered dead together, surrounded by Zulu bodies, still clutching the Queen's colors, which clearly the Zulus weren't going to take it because it didn't really mean anything to them. But it was clear by the Zulu bodies around them that they had both died fighting. A theory, though, has come out about these two men. The theory is, in fact, they were not asked to save the colors, but when the camp was breached and troops began to get overrun, they ran and grabbed the flag, fleeing out of fear. Now, I am not trying to besmirch these two men or question their heroism, but in history we must show all sides and all theories. Just like in my Civil War series about Jenny Wade. It might have not been a Confederate, it might have been a Union. In this situation, maybe it was they were given the flag by Pulain and told, get this, warn the guys at Rorke's Drift and get the flag to safety. But it also could be they could see how it was going and they're like, I'm getting out of here before I get killed. Now, I personally believe they did their duty and they did have orders to go to Rorke's Drift to warn them. There were no cowards at Isandlwana on either sides. But I would not be doing my job as a historian and not tell both possibilities. Chelmsford and the main force would return to Isandlwana. To the west, they would see flames in the air. But all Chelmsford could see is his humiliation. British soldiers found their comrades with their stomachs sliced open and entrails spilled over the ground. A terrifying tale about a young drummer boy being hung from one of the camp's meat hooks with his stomach open hip to hip terrified the British public. Now, the drummer is a complete, some say, no evidence that it ever happened. And the witnesses that said they saw it, it's not known if they are truly trustworthy sources, specifically because this wasn't something the Zulus would do if the enemy was still on the field, because they would still be fighting them. So there really is no one on the field that could have probably seen the Zulus cutting their stomachs open, and there's no evidence that they tortured anyone. What is known is that it is a Zulu custom that after a battle they would disembowel their enemies, not to insult them, torture them, or scare anyone. But in the Zulu custom, it's actually a sign of respect. The Zulus believe that if you are defeated and die in battle, your soul cannot move on. So instead, they would try to release the spirit through the stomach, also so they would not be haunted by those spirits that would be trapped to earth. The Battle of Isandlwana will be the most humiliating defeat to this day that a modern army will suffer from a less industrialized force. You gotta understand, Battle of Little Bighorn, you had 267 U.S. cavalry only armed with carbines. At Isandlwana, they had rocket batteries, they had cavalry, they had infantry, they had irregulars, they had so much. But because of Chelmsford's arrogance, what happened. Of the 1,837 troops at Isandlwana, only 540 would be able to tell the tale of what happened. That's literally more than half. And many of them were just lucky because a lot of the Zulus were told, kill the men in the red uniforms. So a lot of that were native contingents, Natal, who wore blue uniforms, and things like that. Thanks, friends. I love the Zulus, and I feel the Anglo-Zulu War is an extremely overlooked era in history. The British Empire had reached its peak, and it'll be in the coming decades that their downfall would be guaranteed. If you enjoyed, I'd love to ask you to like, share, and comment. If you're a new viewer, I invite you to subscribe. I have new content up daily. Tomorrow we will be discussing Rorke's Drift, and in the words of the Zulus, Kuzkobe Kuzkazai. See you real soon, friends.